In my hand is the Sony a7 III with the Sony 85mm 1.4 lens. Many photographers believe that the 85-1.4 is the pinnacle of prime lenses. It is the ultimate portrait lens, but the problem is this lens costs $1,800. In this hand, I have a much more reasonable version. This is the Samyang 85mm 1.4. It costs just $700. Is it worth $1,100 more for the Sony version? Let's find out. Let's first talk about build quality and features. When you're looking at the Sony lens, there are a few different features that you're certainly not going to see in the Samyang version. Let's first talk about the aperture ring. I thought it was a little strange to see this on a Sony lens because I own other Sony lenses and they don't exist. Normally you change the aperture with the digital knob on the front of the camera, but with this lens you can choose to do it digitally or manually. If you set this to A on the lens, the digital rotator knob will control the aperture like you're probably used to on other lenses, or you can change it and set the aperture manually. On the right side of the lens, you'll notice that there's this knob for click, and you can set it to on or off. When it's on, you can change the aperture in 1/3 stops, and it's got a very satisfying click to it. But if you turn click off, this rotates smoothly. And the reason why this may be important is not really photography based. If you are a videographer and you happen to want to rack your exposure, this may be the easiest and most seamless way to do it. I have to say, I've been shooting video for years. I've never had a need to do that manually. But for instance, if you were going from a dark inside scene to an outside scene and you need to darken up the scene without clicking, 1/3 of a stop at a time, you could turn this knob smoothly and darken your frame very slowly over time. That's obviously not going to be a feature on the Samyang lens, but I also have to be honest and say it's a feature I will probably never use. On the left side of the lens, you'll see an autofocus and manual focus switch, and then right above that, there is an autofocus lock button. If you focus on something and then you let go of the shutter button and then you want to take a picture without refocusing, this button makes it really easy for you to press and then take a picture without refocusing. Now, looking at the Samyang lens, it's almost the exact same size and shape, but it doesn't have any of the same buttons and knobs. In fact, the only thing that it has is this single focus by wire ring. Keep in mind though that all of the extra features on the Sony lens, I'm not sure I personally would ever use. I like being able to change my aperture digitally. I also don't need to switch my lens into manual focus because I can easily do that on the camera body itself. And then the autofocus lock button, I always set my thumb button to do that. So again, I don't necessarily need it on the lens. So keep in mind, that may be where a lot of your money is going. You might be paying for extra features that you never end up using. But what's really most important about these lenses is the image quality. So let's get into that. So for the first test, I wanted to do a sharpness and vignette test. And what I did was I went to the Fstoppers patented flat wall and I shot images all the way from f1.4 to f16. All right, so I have all of these incredible brick wall photos stacked on top of each other in Photoshop here. And this is going to allow us to see them side by side. Now, just looking at this navigator up here, we'll be able to see the vignette. Right now I'm on the Samyang to the Sony, Samyang, Sony, Samyang, Sony. You will notice the Sony tends to have a little bit more of a cool blue cast overall. But at 1.4, it's pretty obvious that the Samyang has more vignetting around the edges. That's the darkening of the edges. Let's zoom into 100%. This is the Samyang at 100% and the Sony. Samyang, Sony. I've got to say, these look identical in the center of the frame. Let's move to the upper right-hand corner. Samyang, Sony, Samyang, Sony. At 1.4 in the upper right-hand corner, Sony's a little bit sharper. Now, if we skip all the way ahead to f16, pretty close again. So maybe the Samyang suffers a little bit more from diffraction than the Sony overall. But again, we are at 100% on this monitor. I do not think you'd be able to see this in printed form. So we're not getting ultra consistent results here. It's kind of strange that some corners of each shot look a little sharper than others. But overall, I think it's safe to say that in the center of the frame, you're gonna get just as sharp of an image out of the Samyang compared to the Sony, but on the edges, the Sony is going to be a little bit sharper. Now, I recently got into an argument with my buddy Pi over at SLR Lounge as to whether or not lenses create significantly different colors. He believed that more expensive lenses had totally different looking colors that were way better looking. And I just felt like if there were any differences at all, moving one slider in Lightroom just the slightest bit would probably bring those colors back or change them enough. But for all of you people who believe that expensive lenses create better colors, let's do a color test. So I've got these beautiful pink, yellow, and green flowers right here in front of this lens. We're gonna start with the Sony lens. I'm locking everything about this shot, including the white balance, and let's take this image, and then we will also shoot with the Samyang. I'm shooting at 1/100th of a second, f8 ISO 400, and my white balance is locked to a Kelvin temperature of 6200. All right, so looking at both of these shots on the back of the camera, there are different colors. The Sony lens is definitely cooler than the Samyang lens. If I had to choose which one I preferred, it would be the Samyang. But again, I feel like that's a white balance issue, and the Sony lens is not creating gorgeous colors that we're not going to be able to recreate with the Samyang, or vice versa. So let's get back to the computer and really look at that a little bit more closely. All right, let's look at these shots and see if there's any difference in color. We do know that the Sony lens has more cool tones to it. So let's just see if we can lower the temperature on the Samyang lens. The other difference that you'll notice is that the Samyang lens is a little bit wider than the Sony. Probably won't matter to anyone, but it's an interesting note. And when I go back and forth between these shots, I mean, it is almost identical. And this is where I feel like everybody who talks about the color or couleur, if they're trying to be really fancy, I just don't see it. I don't believe it. Pi, I think you're wrong. I don't think expensive lenses capture colors better. I think it just changes the white balance. Now, something that I have noticed that more expensive lenses tend to do better at compared to cheaper lenses is handling flare and direct sunlight bouncing into the lens. Usually more expensive lenses have a better lens coating on the front element and maybe even some internal elements that will help with lens flares and ghosting that you'll see when you're shooting into a bright light. So I've set up the camera. I'm gonna be shooting right up towards the sun here in between these trees, and let's see what each of these two lenses does. So I think with this test, it's pretty clear that the Sony has won. The Samyang shot has a green lens flare that's covering a lot of the image. And even if you're the type of photographer that likes to add lens flares in later, it's nice to be able to shoot a clean shot and then have the option to add that if you want to. But again, you have to ask yourself, how often are you shooting directly into the sun like this? It never, ever happens with me. I would never take a picture like this. So you just have to ask yourself, is it worth the extra money for a feature that you might not ever have to really deal with? That's up to you. Now let's talk about autofocus. First, let's talk about autofocus noise. I read some other people complaining that this lens was a little loud with autofocus, and if you happen to be recording audio through your camera, you'd be able to pick it up. Keep in mind, again, we never do that. We always have people mic'd, so that wouldn't be an issue for us. But I have to say, in just the few tests that I've been doing with both of these lenses, I think the Samyang lens is actually quieter than the Sony, and I want you guys to hear for yourselves. So I'm just gonna put this up to the mic and focus a few times. Try not to pay attention to the beep. You can hear a slight clicking and you can hear the elements moving a little bit, but that certainly isn't loud to me. That's just as loud as any other lens I've ever used. Let's try the Sony. You hear that? It sounds like It sounds like radio static or something. That is the weirdest. I've never heard a lens sound like that in my entire life. That is weird. So if we're going on autofocus noise alone, the Samyang is a clear winner here. I don't think either of these lenses are so loud that it would be a problem with a video production, but other people had brought this up, so I definitely wanted to do this test. So now let's talk about autofocus speed. I am just going to move this around, and it's kind of difficult to do this scientifically, but I'm just gonna see how many times this thing fails to focus and how quickly it does focus. We are using the Sony lens right now. Every time it is grabbing focus, it's not the fastest focusing lens that I've ever used, that's for sure. But it seems totally quick enough and 100% accurate. Let's try the Samyang. I have to say, again, this is not a scientific test, but it feels like this autofocus is faster. At the very least, the Samyang is identical to the Sony, but in my mind, I feel like it's a little bit faster. Now, I have read online that if you're shooting video, sometimes Sony lenses can work much better than third-party lenses if you are continuously autofocusing while you shoot video. Let's do that test now. All right, so I'm going to make this incredibly difficult for these cameras. I'm going to be shooting at f1.4, incredibly shallow depth of field. And face detection autofocus is on. Let's see how this looks. All right, David, come on. I'm currently recording with the Samyang lens. All right, it missed focus there for a second. Stop right there. All right, okay, it caught back focus. Can you just walk backwards? Stop right there. Okay, walk backwards. Stop right there. Okay, so as you're moving, it's definitely struggling to keep up with that quick of movement. I don't know if that's a setting in the camera, but go ahead and back up for me. Go ahead and back up where you started, and let's see if we can go a little bit slower and see if it can keep up. Okay? So at this point, David is walking a lot slower. It seems to be doing a great job here. Stop right there. So it lost focus when you started getting close. The cool thing about Sony is it's not hunting like our other cameras. The GH5 will just hunt and it'll wreck the entire shot. This just slowly pulls you back into focus and it looks fantastic. All right, let's go ahead and try the Sony. All right, we're now recording with the Sony. Come on this way, David. So I saw the Sony hunt a little bit. It lost focus again at the end, very similar to the Samyang. Step back a few steps. Okay, stop. Step back a few steps. Stop. And keep going backwards all the way back to the beginning. Maybe it did a little bit better than the Samyang. I mean, this test is insane that we're putting these cameras through. I don't think a human focus puller could do this. All right, it took a little bit. When you stop there, the Sony did take a couple extra seconds to find you. All right, go ahead and walk forward a little bit slower. Just like the Samyang, it seems to be doing a great job. Maybe lost you just for a second. Oh, and right at the end it lost you. But again, still absolutely amazing. And I don't know how many videographers are actually using a feature like this. I think the more realistic use is being able to record somebody standing in one position. Maybe they move around just a little bit slowly and the camera could keep up with that. These focus pulls, again, I don't know that a person could even do that. So again, it's very hard to make a scientific experiment out of this. If I had to guess, maybe I'd say the Sony lens did a little bit better, but I can't tell if that's an issue with the lens. I can't tell if the lighting was different. I can't tell if David was walking a fraction of a mile an hour slower for one than the other. There's so many different factors that could have changed the results, and I feel like we got such similar results that, at least at this point, I'm putting the autofocus on both of these lenses right at the same level. So what have we learned? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. If both of these lenses cost exactly the same amount of money, the Sony lens is the superior choice. However, these aren't even close to the same amount of money. The Sony is well beyond double the price of the Samyang. The Samyang is just $700 while the Sony is $1,800. Now, the Sony certainly has a few extra features. If you need to be able to rack your exposure while shooting video, if for some reason you're always shooting directly into the sun and you don't want to be dealing with lens flares, the Sony might be the clear choice. But for 99% of photographers who are looking for a fast, sharp 85mm lens, the Samyang is an amazing choice. For $1,800 bucks, you would expect Sony to include vibration reduction or something like that in the lens, but neither of these lenses have that. 85mm 1.4 lenses have always been very expensive. It's usually just successful professional photographers who can afford them, and everyone else can't really justify them. I'm really excited that lenses like this are starting to come out. It brings the price way down. It also encourages competition. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a Sony version coming out soon that has image stabilization so that they can compete a little bit more easily with a lens like this. But goodness, I mean, if it were up to me and I could save the $1,100 or put it towards another camera body or another lens, I choose the Samyang all day, every day. For more videos just like this, head over to fstoppers.com, and if you'd like to check out our full-length photography tutorials, head over to fstoppers.com/store.